Hello, historians. Today I'm talking about the Cold War. Actually, I'm doing the Cold War and the 1950s, but I'm splitting them into two half-hour segments because it gets too darn long. Before we start the other things, I'm going to show you a few tables. This is one of the estimated unemployment rate during the Great Depression. Pretty horrible, huh? And I'm going to show you this one. This is U.S. military spending as a percentage of the GDP. So you can see this is a civil war. There was a good amount of military spending. World War I, even more military spending. Then World War II. It was a lot more than we had ever spent before that. And it never quite went down again if you look at the 60s, 80s, and now. We've been spending a significant portion of our GDP on defense. This is the more interesting of these three tables. So this is how much our government borrowed to pay for these wars. So we borrowed some 1812, Civil War, World War I. We were trying to borrow our way out of the Great Depression. But then World War II was completely financed. So 1950, Truman's in power. He's working on continuing with more New Deal policies. He wants to actually put universal health care into his plan to get through Congress. But then the Korean War comes along. And he knows how much debt our nation's already in, and so he chooses to pay for the Korean War from direct taxation and money we already have, and not through borrowing any more money. And so he knows that he's not going to be able to do both, and being fiscally prudent, he put his social policy on the back burner in favor of trying to prevent communism from spreading. Going on into the Cold War, we're borrowing a lot of money through here. Soviet Union falls. In 89-90 it starts collapsing, but by then we're spending a ton of money. The Soviet Union spending somewhere around half its GDP on defense and military buildup. And so Cold War ends right here, give or take. But then the War on Terror, we're borrowing. So this is government debt. This is money you're going to be paying back over the course of your lifetime and over the course of your children's lifetime. So I wanted you to see where your money is going. Okay, so the repercussion of World War II is this Cold War. The Tehran Conference, Stalin was trying to get, America had already promised itself it would help the Allies defend and prosecute the war, but Churchill's trying to bring FDR. No, we're going to fight in North Africa. We're going to fight in West Europe. And Stalin's like, you guys got to open up another European front. I need you over here. My Russians are dying. I need you. And neither FDR or Churchill trusted Stalin. He was a communist. He wasn't a great guy. But FDR knew the political game, and he was willing to work with Stalin, but Churchill's like, come on, no, we can't do this. And Stalin starts seriously mistrusting his allies. As well he should, because they are talking bad about him and making this decision. So here's a picture of the three leaders at the Yalta Conference. Roosevelt's already looking pretty bad by this point. But Roosevelt's like, yeah, no, I'm going to do a little bit more in Europe. We're not just going to fight in Africa. We're not just going to fight in the Atlantic Ocean. We're going to do something. And we did. We were working on it. We did the D-Day invasion, which was really useful. In the middle of all this, then Roosevelt dies and Truman takes office. And Truman, as his name implies, is an honest guy, which probably isn't the best for politics. Roosevelt knew how to play the political game. Truman wasn't that kind of politician. And look at this awkward photo with Stalin and Churchill and him shaking their hands. I don't know, I think that says what we need to know here. Okay. At the same time, China has been in this civil war for a good 20 years by this point, honestly. And this is Chairman Mao here in this Jeep. He was a leader of the Chinese Communist Party. He's getting support from Russia. He went to Russia. He trained in communism. He learned what he needed to know. He did communism somewhat differently in that Soviet Union's like all about the machines and the factories, and it's like China's mostly agricultural. We have to think of the farmers too, and not that he did a better job of communism than the Russians, but he realized that you kind of need farmers to feed people. So this is Shanghai Shek, the person in charge of China that was trying to keep it from falling into communism. They finally lost, and they moved to Taiwan, or Chinese Taipei, depending on who's making that map. The Chinese still refuse to think of it as a separate country. So, Soviet Union, huge communist area. China had fallen to communism. It's a just monstrously large area of land that's now all communist. And Truman, Churchill, the leaders of the free world are terrified that if they don't contain communism, if they don't keep it squished up together, it's going to spread like a parasite, like a disease. So give yourselves a moment when you get a chance to read the Truman Doctrine. It's really short, but it's like any country that wants to stay a democracy, wants to stay capitalist, we will go, we will fight, we will help them stay free. So that's our containment policy, keeping this communist disease from spreading. This image is really indicative of the time. Look at the Chinese, the communists, with their tentacles all over Europe trying to get more and more and more land communist. We don't think to ask the tenant farmers or the peasants what they want, but because we truly believe capitalism is freedom. But a lot of these countries that were going communist, it was the will of the people. Not saying right or wrong, I'm just saying that it was small governments that were being overthrown from within by their own people, and they had the support of the communists. So this was interesting. This was a duality. We were doing everything we could to support, promote capitalism, and the communists, thinking that their system was the best, were doing everything they could to support that. And you guys have heard of third world countries? Have you ever thought about why the word third world? Or have you ever said, well, where's the second world? Well, the truth is, we consider ourselves and our capitalist nations the first world, and the communists were actually the second world. And then we are fighting for these third world countries that weren't in bed with either one yet. And we are fighting over keeping these developing countries. Not all Americans agreed with Truman and the containment policy. Some people, very, very anti-communist, were, no, it needs to be gotten rid of. We can't just contain it. We really should work to get rid of it entirely. And these were a very conservative group, and one of the most famous of these groups was the John Birch Society. They were very active in all kinds of conservative work. And they were active when I was a kid in the 70s. They were against fluoride in water. They're against vaccinations. They think that these were all making the population more docile, more willing to put up with things. In one of their tracts, they wrote that these vaccines, that the fluoride were polluting our precious bodily fluids. And they didn't want the government mandating anything that could come into our lives without our direct permission. They also disagreed with something called the Marshall Plan that I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. The Marshall Plan, okay, not a few minutes, I'm going to talk about it now. The Marshall Plan was, we realized how bad the Versailles Treaty was, how terrible it was to just, oh, country, you owe us billions of dollars. You have to figure out how to give us this billions of dollars, and if you don't, I don't know what we're going to do. So, of course, that's how the Nazi Party came to power, is they were financially suffering. We decided, hey, we're going to help Europe redevelop itself, get its economy back in order. We're, in this picture you see, we're supporting them. We're like putting training wheels on them, getting them back to where they need to be. And the Birch Society is like, no, why should the American taxpayer pay to train up Europe? Well, it's easy. We're paying to train Europe, so it doesn't World War III. Duh. But it was a persuasive argument. People don't like paying taxes. So the Marshall Plan is this rebuilding of Europe. We were doing a similar thing in Japan, too. Let's get these countries economically self-supporting. They'll be less likely to be swiping territory if they've got their economy developed. So George Marshall, strike the John, he was the Supreme Court Justice, a really damn good one. George Marshall he was a general. He was in the president's cabinet. He was a really important person, but his most important contribution was getting Europe back on its feet again after this war. So just know about the Marshall Plan as a way to ensure future peace. Around this time, around the 1950s, the CIA was put into place. And we're going to talk about Europe. I know, American history, so why does this matter? This matters because our relationship with Stalin is the reason for this Cold War business. So, remember, during the war, we came up through Italy, we came over through France. The Soviets were, sorry, I can't find my cursor here. The Soviets were marching towards Germany. And this right here is where the Soviets already were. We got here. Kind of met in what this became the middle. So Berlin was the capital of Germany. And let's see if I can make this bigger. Nope, won't let me make it bigger. Drat. Okay. So we decided in the middle of Germany. So right here's Berlin. This is a cutout. In the middle of the Soviet-occupied Germany, we're going to divide up this capital. And we have a part controlled by the US, a part controlled by the British, and a part controlled by the French. And this side of Berlin is held by the Soviets. Can you imagine this little island of democracy in the middle of this Soviet-controlled area? Strange, isn't it? Well, the people of Germany were used to a more capitalistic system. So a lot of people didn't like the way Berlin was being run under the Soviets at the beginning, so they started coming over to the democratic side. This really wasn't working for the Soviets. So what happens is they built this wall. And so they built up this wall, they cordoned off a partition around the free part of Berlin. Of course, then the free part of Berlin, they can be capitalist all they want, but where are they getting their goods from? Where are they getting their food and shoes and everything they need? Our people started doing airlifts from the free part of Europe into our side of Berlin. And so we're realizing that we're not liking the way this is all working out. So we formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and you can see in blue, this is a modern one that we've added countries since, because Poland was part of the Soviet bloc. So this is the modern map, but our friends in France, in our half of Germany, in the UK, we formed this club. And all the free nations can join our North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So, what do the Soviet allied nations do? They formed themselves their own club, and they called it the Warsaw Pact. So, here's an image of the Berlin airlift trying to get supplies to those cordoned off people in West Berlin. On October 1st, 1949, Mao Zedong proclaimed the establishment of the People's Republic of China, scaring the hell out of the Americans and their allies. So at this time, communism starting to spread. The Korean Peninsula is having a civil war between the communists and our friends in South Korea. So Syngman Rhee was a South Korean politician, and they wanted to stay in power for good reason. Every government wants to stay in power. And the Koreans closest to China were trying to become communist. And so they were having a civil war. Because the Truman Doctrine's in place, our allies, our democratic allies there are like, hey, come help us, we want to stay a free nation. And so, of course, because we have this containment policy in place, we join the fray. And it's a stalemate. We don't do very well. It's a back and forth where the line keeps moving, but it ends up settling at the 38th parallel. China's intervening. MacArthur's our general there. Remember him from moving on the bonus army of our own veterans in Washington? And from his mistakes in World War II. He wasn't a great person. I don't like him. But anyway, MacArthur's, well, the Chinese are behind all this. We got atomic bombs. Why don't we just go ahead and bomb China? Truman's like, we're not doing that again. Absolutely not. You're fired. And so MacArthur's publicly belittling Truman. It becomes this big controversy. Here's just some maps of that back and forth. the communists are doing pretty well. We beat them back. But it's a stalemate. There was never formally peace. We don't have a formal peace treaty. So we have a non-aggression, the word's gone. We have a formal non-aggression going on with North Korea, but we still have our bases there. There's still our forces on one side and the North Korean forces on the other of a demilitarized zone that they're both defending, because we aren't officially in a peace treaty with North Korea. In February 1950, McCarthy became wildly popular. He went before a group in West Virginia and he said, I know of over 200 members of the Department of State that are known communists. And he pushed everybody into this ridiculous hysteria. And they were looking for communists everywhere. He never really produced any names. And this hysteria really lasted until around 1954, when he started saying members of our own army were coddling communists. And that's when it's like, okay, you know, you're a little bit out there. But we wanted someone that would protect us from the enemy. And we had had 20 years of the Democrats in power with Roosevelt and then with Truman. So we wanted a Republican. We wanted someone hard on communism. We picked a war hero with a bucket of charisma, and Eisenhower took the presidency during this time. And he was a good leader that we needed at this time. You can see this fear reflected in the art and movies of the time. So there was a menace in the film. Humphrey Bogart and the film noir became very popular. There was films about the Red Menace. And of course, Invasion of the Body Snatchers coming out later. But it wasn't just that. Alien invaders, mutants, radioactive themes were becoming quite popular. Frequently invaders from the Red Planet, about our stereotypes and our fears about our communist enemy. Japan was having its own film revolution in the wake of World War II. Also, they were getting radioactive monsters, Godzilla and such, out of their experience with the atomic attack. So art reflects what we're feeling. It was reflecting what was being felt in Japan, and this is what we were feeling here. And we had a heck of a lot of anxiety going on. While all this is going on around the world, we're having our own interesting conversation about what communism is, who communists are. In 1947, the House Un-American Activities Committee subpoenaed 79 people on a claim they were subversive and that they were trying to get communist propaganda into films. 10 individuals were cited for contempt of Congress, and they were blacklisted after refusing to answer questions about their alleged involvement with the Communist Party. General people, were being called before Congress and having to answer questions. Have you ever attended are you a communist? No. Have you ever attended a communist meeting? No. Have you read any communist literature or newspapers? No. Do you know any communists? And they were really, the definition of witch hunt comes from this time, because people had to denounce people they suspected of being secret communists. Arthur Miller's play, The Crucible, it's set in Salem during the witch trials, but it's really an allegory for this time. And this is McCarthyism. This is the time when people were afraid to say that the government is going too far, that people should be allowed to talk about what they want. Oh, and an important politician through the 60s and 70s became famous. He made himself famous here in the 1950s. Look at this fresh little face right there. That's Richard Nixon. He made his career going after these communists. Which is why when Mr. Spock in Star Trek The Undiscovered Country says, only Nixon could go to China. This is why Nixon in the 1970s was able to go to China, is because he had cut his teeth on anti-communism. So when he was opening up relations, we knew it was for the good of the country. So there were actually some communist spies here, not anything remotely like McCarthy was saying and Nixon was saying, but there were spies here. So the Rosenbergs were tried and convicted of passing government information, weapons information, to the Soviets. In later declassified stuff, it looks like Ethel Rosenberg knew absolutely nothing about her brother and her husband's involvement with the Soviets. Because Julius Rosenberg was giving information to Ethel's brother was passing it on. But because they were hoping by convicting or saying they were putting her up for the death penalty too, it would get him to confess. He didn't, and so they were both executed for this. We were terrified of subversion in high-ranking government offices, and we made all our federal employees swear this federal employee oath. That, of course, they were going to uphold the our principles, our beliefs, and it ends in "So help me God." And there were people rightly upset with having to swear this loyalty oath. First, some religions don't let you swear oaths to secular organizations. And secondly, this upset atheists too, because it has "So help me God" in that oath. So now, we know that the Cold War hysteria, the fear of communists, was completely overstated. That our national policies going after communists and communism was exceptionally expensive. And our containment policy had some faults. But this is the backdrop for the entire 1950s. And so our next presentation is going to be talking about social, political stuff here at home. So, thank you for listening. Tune in again.